Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here with Bill Schofield and with John Harrigan. Howdy, guys. How's it going?
Doing well.
Doing good.
Great to be with you guys as always, listeners, and it is always awesome to have you with us as well. Today, we want to talk about the book of Ezekiel. In our last episode, we spent some time talking about Jeremiah, and we discussed how Jeremiah is prophesying the Babylonian invasion, and really this is all just in light of covenantal maintenance, in light of Israel's unfaithfulness to the covenant, and God bringing the curses on them as he promised he would do, because he's chosen them to be the nation through which all the rest would be blessed. And this is really what we want to develop in today's episode with Ezekiel, is the same theme, covenantal maintenance, the future eschatological exile and redemption of Israel, all of these same ideas of how Jeremiah was apocalypticized by the later Second Temple authors. We're going to see the same with Ezekiel. Now, before we get into these themes, let's just do a quick overview of the book, guys, like we normally do. I think it's really interesting because Ezekiel is unorganized. In Jeremiah and in Isaiah, you get more of a chronological progression, sometimes a grouping of passages that would have themes and ideas together. But Ezekiel really seems to be unorganized, unlike some of the other prophets.
Yeah, I mean, you have clear themes that happen in Ezekiel, the heavenly revelations of God and the throne, which are real pronounced in the first couple chapters and then come back in chapter 10. You have the revelatory kind of experiences where Ezekiel's taken to the temple and shown the idolatry in the temple, chapters 8 and 11. But there's just a lot of prophetic declarations of judgment throughout the book, particularly of Israel and the nations in the chapters in the 20s and early 30s. There's a lot of imagery and metaphor of coming divine judgment, like the useless vine in chapter 15 or the faithless bride in chapter 16, which is particularly graphic. The two eagles in chapter 17, the two women in chapter 23, and then the ungodly shepherds in chapter 34. So it has a fairly negative overall tone that characterizes the book.
Yeah, and then the latter part of the book is a lot more positive. I guess that it's kind of interwoven. You have starting in chapter 34, about halfway through that chapter, you have a switch to really speaking about the eschatological redemption of Israel, and kind of climaxing in 37. That section with the Valley of Dry Bones, and then in 38 and 39, again, like Josh said at the beginning, it's fairly unorganized. Chronologically, it doesn't flow like one would expect. It's actually it'll describe an event, and then next chapter will be describing an event that preceded that event, and then it'll move forward again. And so then you have, of course, Gog and Magog and the eschatological battle in chapters 38 and 39. And then 40 through the end of the book, you have the future temple complex and the land allotments and different dynamics that'll comprise the temple and the land of Israel in context to the resurrection.
So then you also, in the midst of all of that, you get Ezekiel doing some pretty strange prophetic things, some weird prophetic acts throughout the book. And, these are just interspersed as well. You get something like the siege of Jerusalem in chapter 4 and all the little things that he does to, what did we say earlier? Like he's playing his ancient version of Lincoln Logs.
Lincoln Log prophecy.
Yeah, Lincoln Log prophecy. There you go, right? You get the whole him laying on his side for 390 days. That's also in chapter 4. 390 days for the punishment of Israel and then another 40 days for Judah. I mean, I'm not a side sleeper, but obviously the Lord's having Ezekiel do this for a very strange.
That's painful.
Yeah, it's pretty painful, right?
I have to sleep on my side.
Do you? There you go. Well, Ezekiel didn't seem to enjoy it all that much.
No.
Also in chapter 4, you get him making some bread, that classic Ezekiel bread that at least you see in Western grocery stores, except this time he has to make it over some dung. You're like, well, okay, interesting, Ezekiel.
It's not real Ezekiel bread unless it's cooked over dung.
Yeah, I think we should all get our money back if it's like mislabeled.
Yeah. I mean, the dung's the main point of the prophecy.
It really is.
So it's not the bread.
Right. And that's from Ezekiel 4. Then you get some more prophetic acts that happen in chapter 12 with captivity and baggage and things going on there. But with all of these themes and ideas in the book of Ezekiel, the disorganization of it, I think there is an overarching theme and a theme that is central, as we saw in the book of Jeremiah. And that's the theme of the maintenance of the covenant and the covenantal dynamic of God's covenant with Israel playing out in history and in the future. As we saw it in Jeremiah, we see this here in Ezekiel.
Yeah, we mentioned this briefly in the Deuteronomy episode, but there's a strange anomaly in the dating of the book in chapter 1. So you have chapter 1, verse 1, in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river. So you might not think all that much about that until you read the next verse. On the 5th day of the month, as it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi. So there's two different datings. And so even moderns try to kind of decipher what the point is. Some Jewish strands of thought, and including the Targums, actually viewed the first dating being like the dating in terms of, how they used to say in the 3rd year of Uzziah and the 3rd year of this king. So that would be like the common way of dating. But in chapter 1, verse 1, the dating represented the amount of time that had passed since the recovery, because there's not a referent in the 30th year of what? Where does the 30 years begins? And so they suggest that the referent is the rediscovery of the book of the law under Josiah. And so that basically the book is being framed in terms of the rediscovery of the book of the law, just like Jeremiah was framed in the same way, which really makes a lot of sense out of a few things. Like we mentioned in Jeremiah, the very first prophecy of I'm watching over my word to perform it is really I'm watching over my word is a reference to the Torah, or at least the book of Deuteronomy. But we have the same thing here, where a central part of Ezekiel's calling is that visionary thing that he sees that's fairly well known, where a scroll descends out of heaven, and he's told to look at the scroll, and then he's told to eat the scroll, and that kind of authorizes him or enables him to go and to be this witness to Israel for God and to not relent. Because that's the point of chapter 2. He's like, don't shrink back because they're not going to like it, but you gotta be faithful. And supposedly eating the scroll is actually what enables him to be bold when they are resistant. And so the point is that likely frames the scroll as actually being it's imagery to remind him of the book of the law that was recently rediscovered. And again, in the Targum tradition of Ezekiel 2 verses 9 and 10, it says this. It just elaborates a little bit on the scroll that he's given. And I saw, and behold, the form of a hand descended to the side, or extended to the side towards me. And behold, it was a scroll of a book. And he spread it before me, and behold, it was inscribed on the face of it and on the reverse side of it, that which was from the beginning, that which was destined to be in the end. In it was written that if the house of Israel will transgress against the Torah, the nations will have dominion over them. But if they observe the Torah, he will remove lamentation, weariness, and groaning from them. And so this is kind of like an intro to the book, is that this is basically the scroll, at least in the way the Targum is seeing it, this is the scroll that Ezekiel eats. It's a scroll that is essentially going to frame the future of Israel in terms that are, to us, they'd be more familiar from the Torah or from the book of Deuteronomy. So like Josh said, that theme of covenant maintenance is very prominent in Ezekiel as well. And from the onset, I think it really attempts to frame the book that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the book as a whole isn't super apocalyptic as far as the developed themes that are later seen in apocalyptic literature, but a lot of the elements in Ezekiel kind of set the rails for how apocalyptic develops later on.
Right.
Particularly the kind of two axes of apocalyptic literature, the heavenly revelation and the future eschatological revelation. And so, anyone who's familiar with the kind of academic debate around apocalypticism will know John Collins's definition that he and the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature Committee, developed in 77, 78, got published in 79, and it's kind of become the standard definition of what apocalyptic means. And so he puts it in the intro to...
Which actually means nothing anyways.
Right.
The fact that there's a standard means nothing. And for you listeners who aren't versed in this, just know that we are sparing you one of the most annoying conversations of what apocalyptic is interpreted to be in the academy.
Yes, totally.
It basically means anything. Anything you want it to mean.
There's so much debate and argument around it, and there had been for, 70, at least 70 years up to that point, that basically the SBL created a committee and said, these are the best guys we have. You guys hammer out a basic definition, and it stood the test of time. But there's constant...
Until the 2000s.
Right. And then insanity reintroduced itself. But Collins's definition, and Collins isn't a believer, he's critical, but it's unbiased at least, because everybody else tries to define it because of their theological agenda they bring to. Basically, people bring to Second Temple literature an agenda to argue that Jesus and the apostles are different from that. And so they're biased in their reading of it. Collins, at least, isn't biased, so he reads it straightforward. And there's nobody on earth who's more knowledgeable about Second Temple literature than John Collins. And so anyway, his definition goes like this. Apocalyptic is a genre of revelatory literature within a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar that it involves another supernatural world. Now, of course, Jews at the time didn't view the universe natural and supernatural, so that's a little bit anachronistic. But the idea is that it's vertical in the sense that apocalyptic literature has these heavenly travels, second Enoch, third Baruch particularly, and it's temporal in as far as it pushes things to its ultimate end, the day of the Lord, the resurrection of the dead, the messianic kingdom, etc. And so Ezekiel, you have kind of those two main things, the heavenly revelation that happens in the first couple chapters, picked up in chapter 10, of God and the heavenly throne, and which really, gets picked up a lot more later on in apocalyptic literature. And then the future revelation of the future, which you get kind of the future judgment, and then the future restoration, which plays out particularly at the end of the book.
Yeah, like Ezekiel is unique amongst the prophets because you have Isaiah 6 experience, which is unique, but like John said, it's the fact that an angel comes to Ezekiel and actually gives him the revelation.
Right.
So this is this. So you have it in chapters 8 through 11. There's a couple episodes in there where you have that dynamic where the source of the revelation is an angel that came down to visit, and he's really the first one of the writing prophets that we see that, like I said, you have Isaiah who had that experience in heaven. You also have Joshua, because he's in the Nevi'im, he's in the prophetic literature, that has the angel come and speak with him. But where you actually have the angel delivering a message for the people for the future. And so Ezekiel 8 through 11, you have that, and that really gets picked up later. Mostly in the biblical prophets, you really only have Daniel and Zechariah, I think, that have that kind of a vision of an angel, or the angel comes down and then communicates to them something about the future. Yeah. But really, Ezekiel's the starting point for that. So that becomes really influential in kind of the way apocalyptic writers are going to think and the way they're going to write about things, is that experience becomes a lot more important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as you said, John, I think the two aspects that we want to develop here are heavenly revelation in terms of ideas that are communicated about things going on in the heavens, like for example, the starting in Ezekiel 1 and then again into Ezekiel 10, as you mentioned, but these wheels within the wheels and God's throne chariot and these heavenly travel narratives that we've referenced in the past on our show, and then eschatological revelation. So what's the point of all of that? I mean, why would the Lord show Ezekiel these things and then give him a bunch of messages about the future after?
Yeah, I mean, I think it communicates the reality of divine sovereignty. It instills kind of a sense of awe that you have this power that is beyond comprehension that's being revealed. But the point of that power is that it's being applied to covenantal history. It's not kind of the idiosyncrasies of the curiosity of the ultra pietistic or whatever. It's God is revealing himself because he's committed to the covenant playing out to its ultimate end. And so you get this in Second Temple literature, for example, in 1 Enoch 14, where Enoch says, I observed and saw inside it a lofty throne. So Enoch's taken up to this house or temple in the heavens. He says, inside of it is a lofty throne. Its appearance was like crystal and its wheels like the shining sun. And I heard the voice of the cherubim, and from beneath the throne were issuing streams of flaming fire. So he picks up a little Daniel there. It was difficult to look at, and the great glory was sitting upon it. As for his gown, which was shining more brightly than the sun, it was whiter than any snow. So you kind of have the gown or the train from Isaiah 6 there picked up. None of the angels was able to come in and see the face of the excellent and glorious one, and no one of the flesh can see him. The flaming fire was round about him, and a great fire stood before him. No one could come near to him from among those that surrounded the tens of millions that stood before him. Speaking of the angelic host. And then it goes on, about the future and the restoration. But the point, from chapter 1 of 1 Enoch 1 is the revelation of, behold, the Lord is coming with tens of millions of his holy ones, and they're coming to Sinai. And for the eschatological judgment and the restoration of Israel, because of course that's where the nation began, at Sinai, so that's where the restoration is initiated. And so the revelation of the divine throne room and the chariot, that, the same kind of theme is picked up in First Enoch is in context to the coming judgment. But it's pushed more to its ultimate end in apocalyptic literature.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. So not just random heavenly revelation, but for the sake of the covenant. And I think this can lead us into talking about the second point that we want to highlight in Ezekiel, which is not just heavenly revelation, but eschatological revelation, right? And I think we see this, maybe an instrumental chapter where we can see this playing out in terms of the maintenance of the covenant and this whole cycle and this idea that we've talked about is in Ezekiel 20. And Ezekiel 20 is a really, really significant chapter where Israel's history of the Exodus and their time in the wilderness is used as a paradigm saying that this is what's going to play out and repeat eschatologically in the phrase that's used in Ezekiel 20 is the wilderness of the nations. And this is, again, just this theme of the recapitulation and rehashing of Israel's history to say, hey, let's look back. Let's use the Deuteronomistic paradigm of how Moses would highlight these same ideas and saying, hey, let's look back at Israel's history and explain what's going on in the present in relation to the covenant, right? And again, because all of this is in context of the covenant that God made with Israel. If we take the covenant out of the picture, heavenly revelation just becomes this cool idea, and all of these random things that happen to Ezekiel have no depth of and foundation of meaning. And so again, eschatological revelation throughout Ezekiel is seen in the context of Israel's covenantal paradigm playing out in their future.
Good.
Yeah, and you get, in chapter 20, it's kind of you get two chapters, chapter 11 and chapter 20, where you get the restoration spoken real particularly that then gets picked up at the end of the book. But the all of the judgment, because of course Ezekiel has a very negative overall tone, but you get these little,
he is in exile. I mean, it's understandable.
Yeah.
Right. It's a difficult situation. But you get these chapters where it's clear that the judgment is unto the restoration of the covenant and the restoration of Israel. Yeah. So in chapter 20, verse 33, as I live, declares the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand and outstretched arm and with wrath poured out, I will be king over you. So the Lord being king and the pouring out of wrath is divine discipline in relationship to the covenant. And I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out of the countries where you're scattered with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with wrath poured out. I will bring you into the wilderness of the people, and there I will enter into judgment with you face to face as I entered into judgment with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Israel. So I will enter into judgment with you, declares the Lord. I will make you pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. I will purge out the rebels from among you, and those who transgress against me. I will bring them out of the land where they sojourn, but they will not enter the land of Israel. Then they'll know that I am the Lord. I am the Lord. And so the same kind of dynamic that happened in the wilderness, where the Lord is purging and restoring the covenant, he's saying this is happening on a grander scale, but the same cycle. And so you see that happen. That's the driver for the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a powerful chapter. That whole description right there that's one of the most sober passages in the whole Bible, I think, especially if you're a Jew. It ought to be.
Yeah.
But that's a framing the redemption and with those terms is like, whew. That's intense. I think another element. I was thinking about this last night as I knew we were going to be recording today. Another element of, it's not only Ezekiel, but Ezekiel's a part of it. Is we kind of take for granted when we say the prophets that we assume the written prophets. But we know just from even some of the historical books that there's plenty of prophets that didn't write anything. Elijah and Elisha, for example. We have no writings from them. There are other writings. There are other prophets. There's another prophet who's generally the other prophets during Jeremiah's time were false, but there's another one named Uriah who was legit, saying the same thing as Jeremiah. And we don't have any books from him. And so one of the things that seems to characterize written prophecy is that it was assumed, and this goes all the way back to the Torah, is that written prophecy is written down because it doesn't relate to the immediate generation. And so it needs to be handed on so that it's relevant for a generation to come. So it makes me think of a few passages that I've looked at over the years along these lines, but Deuteronomy 31 is definitely the kind of the paradigm shaper. If you go to, so Deuteronomy 31 is like the intro to the Song of Moses. And the way this is why the Song of Moses is so important, is here's the intro to the book, is the Lord says, now therefore, this is in Deuteronomy 31:19, now therefore write this song for yourselves and teach it to the sons of Israel, put it on their lips, so that this song may be a witness for me against the sons of Israel. Right? And then you jump up to verse 21 and he says, then it shall come about when many evils and troubles have come upon them, this song will testify before them as a witness. So at some point in the future, he wants this song to be used as a testimony to them when they're in hard times. But then he clarifies down in verse 29, for I know that after my death you will act corruptly and turn away from the way that I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days. For you will do which is evil in the sight of the Lord. And so in the first two verses I read, he said, write a song so that it will serve as a witness for you when hard times and evil comes upon you. And in verse 29, he clarifies, the evil is going to befall you in the latter days. And so I had Moses write this book so that it will be actually a witness to you uniquely in the latter days, in the evil that will befall you during that time. And Isaiah Isaiah follows in the same tradition, the first of the writing prophets, in Isaiah 30. Again, encapsulates the same idea. Verse 8 says, go now and write it before them on a tablet, inscribe it in a book, so that it may be for the time to come as a witness forever. So the fact that it's written, that the oracles are written down, assume they're for the future. And Habakkuk is probably, the most straightforward. The Lord answered and said to me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that the runner may read it, or rather so that the reader may run. For there is still a vision for the appointed time, and it speaks of the end. It does not lie. So the point is that there's something coming for the future. And in order to communicate it to them, what we need to do is we need to write it down, not just say it with our mouths, because there's trouble coming in the future that if the person who understands these things, then they can respond appropriately. And so the point is that just the fact of being a part of the written prophets actually assumes that there's something pushed off into the future that the prophets were actually appointed by God to influence or to impact. And so we can also see the kind of indirect impact on apocalypticism there, because essentially that's what the apocalyptic writers did. They looked at the writing prophets, saw the events that had not really occurred, and compiled them and pressed them off into the future.
Yeah, I think this is it's a great point that's not really appreciated. Like, why do things get written down, and why, as far as canonization, how do they get organized? And a lot of people are just kind of like pulling, just give me the information. Like, what is it? What's it saying? What are the themes? But the why behind the beginning of the writing of the prophetic material, I think is really helpful in understanding the development of thought and the pushing forward of themes into the future. because it's for the next generations. It's for the generations to come instead of just that one.
Exactly.
That's a great point.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Well, I think a passage within the book of Ezekiel that really is a significant one along these very lines of written prophecy, anticipating something to be unfolded at a later point in time. Like you said, Bill, from Deuteronomy 30, 31, and Isaiah 30, and Habakkuk 2, is this common passage, well known from Ezekiel 38 and 39. And this is the battle of Gog and Magog. If you're familiar with the book of Revelation or some other Second Temple literature, maybe even the Targums or common Jewish literature, existing at the time now, even as well in the Mishnah, like you're going to see references to Gog and Magog there. And so if you're not familiar, Gog and Magog, Gog is a figure and Magog is a land. And Ezekiel 38 and 39 describes a big, massive battle that has to do with the covenantal dynamic again, God's dealings with the nations in light of his dealings with Israel. And we've talked about this in the past, that God doesn't arbitrarily just deal with the nations. He's dealing with the nations in context to his covenant with Israel, right? And so this is what we see playing out in Ezekiel 38 and 39. In particular, we have a very similar, that similar phrase that we saw that you mentioned, Bill, from the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy. And in the latter days, evil will befall you. You see this again in Ezekiel 38, verse 16. In the latter days, I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, that when through you, O Gog, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. Right? So you get, again, this idea of a written prophecy anticipated in a future playing out, all within the covenantal dynamic, right? And the crazy part about this passage is, even in Ezekiel 38, 39, how this gets quoted even in Revelation, it's like Ezekiel is in exile and he's receiving a vision of a future return and a future battle in another exile and then another return from that exile. That's crazy that that's all happening in this context. And right. So clearly Ezekiel is seeing this and should be understanding this as something that has to do with the future. Yeah. Now, in any strand of Judaism today that really still acknowledges the inspiration of the prophets, this scenario of Gog and Magog is really the only one that hasn't played out in history. And 11th century Judaism, when you can go back to someone like Maimonides, the Rambam, he says this in the Middle Ages when he's writing. This is from the Mishnah Torah, actually. This is from Kings and Wars 12:2. It says, from the plain meaning of the words of the prophets, we understand that at the beginning of the days of the Messiah, there will be the war of Gog and Magog. Before the war of Gog and Magog, a prophet will arise to correct Israel and prepare their hearts, i.e. direct them to God. As it says, behold, I will send you Elijah, quoting from Malachi 3. And just, it goes to show you that, I mean, sure, from the 11th century, they're still thinking about Gog and Magog as a future event. But I mean, even before that, you get something like the Sibylline Oracles. And the Sibylline Oracles, again, quoting and thinking and talking about Ezekiel 38 and 39 as a forward-looking eschatological revelation and projection of what's going to happen in Israel's future. Sibylline Oracles 3 makes this point in 319 to 323. Woe to you, land of Gog and Magog, situated in the midst of Ethiopian rivers. How great an effusion of blood you will receive, and you will be called a habitation of judgment among men, and your dewy earth will drink black blood. Very harsh image, but not something that would have been uncommon or misinterpreted by the hearers of the Sibylline Oracles. And of course, this gets projected forward into the book of Revelation as well. In Revelation 19, Revelation 20, and Revelation 21, we see Gog and Magog, and it's all, again, in context to God's covenant with Israel playing out as he intended it and as he said it would in Moses.
Yeah, I think the Maimonides, that reference, I mean, Maimonides is about as non-apocalyptic as you get in Jewish history, and the fact that even there you get a futuristic, fairly apocalyptic revelation. That vision that's given in Ezekiel has stood the test of time as. And that becomes, Gog and Magog becomes the primary Antichrist text throughout Jewish history, and so it's a go-to. It's a go-to for that.
Yeah. You also might remember back from season 2 with Devin and Stephanie, And they mentioned that even their secular neighbors they're secular. They know the war of Gog and Magog is coming. They say it's well known. You don't have to even be a believer.
Pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Right, but the Gog and Magog gets, developed within the apocalyptic framework and kind of crystallizes within that. And then later on, after the catastrophe of 70 AD, when apocalypticism is pushed aside, still the crystallized reality of the Antichrist holds, and then kind of reforms later on in the Jerusalem Talmud. You get kind of an ebb and flow throughout Jewish history, but Gog and Magog really found its place in the apocalyptic worldview in Second Temple time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another major theme in that's really influential from Ezekiel in Second Temple literature is we find the Ezekiel 37 in the Valley of Dry Bones. And so so clearly Ezekiel 36 and 37 are meant to go together. They're meant to be understood together. And so it's often interpreted as strictly a prophecy about the restoration of Israel. Sometimes even a prophecy about the restoration of Israel from the Babylonian exile. But that simply just can't be the case. There's many reasons why that can't be the case. But in the Second Temple literature is really where you find that Jews during the Second Temple time are both interpreting that passage as the eschatological redemption of Israel as well as a referent for the general resurrection of the righteous. So it made sense to a Second Temple Jew that you could kind of talk about it in both terms, since really the two events are inseparable, right? That's why you have Paul up in Romans 11 speaking of Israel saying, if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So it's assumed that the two events go together. So we shouldn't find it odd that in Second Temple that these two eschatological events, both the eschatological redemption of Israel as well as the eschatological resurrection, are often derived from this same passage.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they all go together because everything is understood as coming to a climactic end. And so of course, the resurrection, the kingdom, the judgment, the day, the final revelation of God all comes together in climax. But that particular vision plays out, for example, in the animal apocalypse in First Enoch. And so the end of the animal apocalypse, which I think we've talked about some, but it's a bizarre vision of different animals that recapitulates Israel's history in different forms of animals, and or actually all of humanity. It starts out with Adam, but particularly with Israel, and Israel are sheep in the vision. And so at the end of the vision, it talks about kind of the persecution and suffering of the sheep, and then the coming of the Messiah, the Lord of the sheep. And so it says in chapter 90, then the sheep cried out, for their flesh was being eaten by the birds. I too cried out and lamented in my sleep on account of that shepherd who was grazing the sheep. I kept seeing till those sheep were eaten by dogs, the eagles, and the kites, and they left neither flesh nor skin nor sinew on them absolutely until their bones stood there bare. Then their bones fell to the ground and the sheep became few. So you get kind of a reference to the valley of dry bones, nothing left.
Absolutely.
And then it goes on, verse 18, I kept seeing till the Lord of the sheep came to them and took in his hand the rod of his wrath and smote the earth. Verse 20, then I kept seeing till a throne was erected in the pleasant land, and he sat upon it, if for the Lord of the sheep, and he took all the sealed books and opened those books in the presence of the Lord of the sheep. So you get a reference to the restoration to the land and the final judgment.
Yeah. There's a another passage in we've referenced here 1st and 2nd Maccabees before. There's actually 4 Maccabees, and interesting. The 4th book of Maccabees, and all 4 Maccabee books are actually just different retellings.
It's weird.
Yeah, 4 Maccabees is a little weird, but all 4 Maccabees books are retelling the same event from different vantage points, and 4 Maccabees is really odd, but there's a reference to what I'm more familiar with in 2nd Maccabees 7. Which is the story of the 7 martyrs, the 7 sons who give their lives in martyrdom to remain faithful to the covenant. And their mom comes on in the very last scene. Well, here the mom actually appears at the beginning in this retelling of it. And she's basically going to exhort them to embrace martyrdom in order to maintain faithfulness to the covenant. And so what she says in chapter 18, verse 14, is he reminded you. She's evoking their dad. She said, your dad died, but he was a godly man, and he trained you guys in the hope of Israel. And she says, he reminded you of the scripture of Isaiah, which says, even though you go through the fire, the flame will not consume you. Because that's part of the torture of how they were killed was fire. And he sang to you songs of the psalmist David, who said, many are the afflictions of the righteous. And he recounted to you Solomon's proverb, there is a tree of life for those who do his will. He confirmed the query of Ezekiel, shall these dry bones live? So he's saying your dad confirmed to you and answered Ezekiel's question. And then he says, for he did not forget to teach you the song that Moses taught, which says, I kill and I make alive. This is your life in the length of your days. And so she's exhorting them to embrace martyrdom, and she's framing all of these passages in context to the resurrection.
Right.
And so she's basically saying he answered Ezekiel's question, shall these dry bones live, in context to Deuteronomy 32, I kill and I make alive.
Yeah.
This is your life in the length of your days. And so pretty awesome where in this retelling of the event, she's exhorting them to embrace suffering because of the certainty of the resurrection of those who die in loyalty to the covenant. And the story is so provoking, but I love this passage as well from 4 Maccabees.
Yeah. Yeah, guys, it's great. Well, we just looked at a couple examples from Second Temple literature. What about the New Testament? Some things that maybe continue the apocalyptic tradition and presume upon this covenantal framework that reference Ezekiel.
Yeah, I think the clearest example would be Revelation 4 in the 4 and 5 in the New Testament, where you get kind of the being taken up and the seeing of God and the throne. And it's not so much the throne room in Ezekiel, but it's the revelation of God in the heavenly realms.
Yeah.
That has become, by the time of Revelation, fairly commonplace, but that kind of theme is opened up in Ezekiel.
For sure. The other one that I think, we've mentioned this in the past a little bit. You did earlier, Bill, with Ezekiel 36 and 37. And in our past, in season 1, we mentioned John 3 and the connection between John 3 and Ezekiel 36 and 37. But the other one that I think would be worth mentioning here is John 10. And the classic passage is Jesus saying, I'm the gate, the shepherd, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the door, all the different imagery that he uses there related to sheep and shepherd. And oftentimes when we read this, we don't really think much about the prophets, but this is a clear reference to Ezekiel 34 and what God says will come for Israel, especially eschatologically. And that's really this idea of an eschatological shepherd coming to restore Israel to the land, to fulfill the covenantal promises, to make them dwell in the land safely, none to make them afraid, because there's been bad leaders and bad shepherds who have not helped Israel walk in obedience to the Torah, who have led Israel to go after other gods and have led them astray. And so Ezekiel 34 is super clear in the sense that God says, I'm going to deal with that, and I'm going to be your shepherd, and I'm going to raise up for you a shepherd, And this is what John 10 comes along to say. Jesus is quoting these very words from Ezekiel 34 and saying, yeah, I'm the shepherd of Israel. All of you Pharisees, leaders of Israel who have not been leading Israel into obedience to the covenant, or you're trying to distance yourselves from those who aren't walking in the covenant instead of shepherding them and helping them to walk in the covenant, I'm going to deal with you. And this is really what's going on in Ezekiel 34, and then this is what Jesus picks up on in John 10.
I think, the good shepherd metaphor that Jesus uses is everybody who hears it in his day. It's not really so much today. It's just kind of like Jesus is the good shepherd for, whatever end people are chasing after.
Right.
But in the first century, that is developed out of some really intense messianic expectation.
Yeah.
And you get that out of Ezekiel 34. I just thought it'd be good to read it. I will rescue my flock. They shall no longer be a prey, and I will judge between sheep and sheep. So even the other places, Matthew 9, where Jesus looks out and he sees that they're like sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah.
So the even that is being heard, by his disciples when he's saying that as I'm the Messiah who's going to be set up as the true shepherd. And he says, verse 23 in Ezekiel 34, and I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, and I have spoken. And so it's got intense messianic expectations tied to the covenant, and it's assumed the other eschatological events that were tied to it.
Yeah. That's great. Well, guys, great show today. Listeners, we hope this has been encouraging, and we hope that Ezekiel makes a little bit more sense now, and you see it as, again,
I don't know about that. That's a tall order.
Well,
I want to lower expectations.
perhaps, but hopefully you see the themes that are pushed forward, and you see Jewish eschatology and the covenantal dynamic in Ezekiel maybe more than you did an hour ago. So
we didn't touch much on Ezekiel 40 through 48, but
that's true. Yeah,
that's true.
Maybe another episode.
Yeah. And we've done some Q&A episodes that have addressed Ezekiel 40 through 48 in the past, but perhaps on another episode we can tackle that. But listeners, it's great to have you with us. Join us again next time as we continue our look through the prophets. We want to take some time to look at Hosea and Joel. Until then, thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless, and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.